Hello students. Today we are going to talk about the French and Indian War. This is early colonial history in the U.S. My name is Mark Egbert and I will be your teacher today. Giving a little background on the French and Indian War, other common aliases it has is also known as the 7 Years' War. This is in reference to the amount of time it took. It lasted about 7 years. The war was declared officially between Great Britain and France in 1756. Great Britain and France were looking to expand their territories up in the northeastern area of the United States. This is known as the Ohio Valley, and it's a highly sought after land area. It is usually highly sought after is because it is highly fertile. There was many tracts of land that were used for various types of farming, from corn to tobacco to any kind of staple goods to try and grow the economy, and it was prime tracts of land in order to do what the settlers wanted to do, which was sustain their lives and own many acres. The outlook of the French and Indian War, as you can see over here on this map, took place mainly in the northeast, and like we talked about, the Ohio valleys. This is a map of where many of the forts were and where many of the battles took place. This is also known as the River Valley Wars because most of the battles took place on rivers, and this was because most of the forts were on rivers. Rivers were a mode of transportation. It was a mode of carrying the goods upstream or downstream in order to sell them at the market, as means of how the farmers made their livings. The battles were fought strictly in the colonies, all the way from down here in Virginia to Nova Scotia, which isn't pictured. The French colonies were not as populated as the British colonies. The French usually stayed somewhat north of the Great Lakes into Canada and modern-day Quebec. They were trying to expand their powers and their land grasp, and so they were trying to come down into the Ohio Valley. But the British had pretty much populated the whole area, often signing treaties with Iroquois leaders and Confederacy of the Iroquois in order to sustain those treaties to grab the land from them, essentially. The French, because they didn't have that many colonies, were using Indian alliances. They were able to bribe them and use them in their battles. One outlook from the French and Indian War, or cause of it, is it started another global war. France, because the fighting took place, ended up having to fight Prussia over in Europe, and many other countries joined in battles, and so essentially Britain and France were fighting a two-front war. Back home, they were fighting the European powers, and here they were fighting each other. One thing that's important to note, that on the effect of the colonies fighting each other here, it was mostly the actual colonials fighting each other, the French colonials fighting the British colonials, along with the Iroquois nation, which were fighting mostly on the French side. It was important because this was a key point, which we'll discuss a little bit later on, which we should be getting to here in a second. Here's a simplified version of the map. This is the areas that were disputed. Above here was the French areas. British had control of this area, and the fighting was going over this land area. The French had made many treaties with the Iroquois Confederacy in order to secure the main power they needed to fight. The manpower, sorry. Lands, money, and ammunitions, along with the driving out of the British, were promised rewards for the Iroquois nations to fight alongside the French. The French did not want the British there, and neither did the Iroquois, because the Iroquois viewed them as land grabbers and invasioners and treaty breakers and people that had stolen their homes and their properties and driven them away. So they were more so mad at the British and not the French. They saw the French as a way to get back into their homelands. Moving on to our last. There are very many important factors from the outcome of this war. One of the many factors that came into play was that the French, as a result of being the losers in this war, were driven back across the Ohio Valley into Canada. This prevented them from establishing very many settlements. They had Canada, but they also owned all this land over in Louisiana's modern-day Louisiana Purchase. But because they were two separate areas, it was hard to connect the two, and they were essentially cut off from each other, so they were withheld from developing one area of land. And so this essentially led to the purchase of the Louisiana Territory. One other aspect of this is it allowed Britain to strengthen their colonies. The colonies had a strong foothold there, and it allowed them to develop and grow more crops and have more settlements, in turn strengthening the British colonies. One thing that Britain didn't count on is the colonies learned how to build their own strength and confidence, which eventually led to the Revolution. This was a result of many of the colonial leaders having to essentially lead the colonies against the French because the British were so far away. It was essentially the colonies versus the French and the Indians. So many leaders were born, such as George Washington, and they learned their battlefield experiences from this war, which led to their importance and knowledge in the future Revolutionary War, which would essentially lead to the two separate nations of the United States and Britain. Well, class, this is the beginnings of the French and Indian War, and it's the importance factors of it. And to learn more, we will move on in further lessons.